This is episode 4 of Democracy After Disaster, a 9-part documentary podcast series that is best listened to in order from episode 1. Not long after Black Saturday, without a business bone in my body, I quit my council job and stepped into the wilderness of self-employment and set up an online thing I called Fire in Mind. I knew from my CFA work that loads of people wanted to be treated as intelligent partners in managing the risk of bushfire, not as children given rigid binary options. As someone later pointed out to me, that is actually not a business plan. In between spinning the wheels of trying to sell a few books and blankets, I read and wrote and thought long and hard about communities living with fire. I went to the Royal Commission and watched as families of those who died were treated with reverence and care. And in between, I listened as lawyers did what lawyers do: argue, attack, defend, and counterattack.
No excuse or spin can justify what we say is a removal from the responsibility at the very hour of crisis.
It would be human to have overlooked things, to have made mistakes. We say, please don't criticise them for it.
To leave without ensuring a responsible person was in place, we say, is an oversight of grave proportions.
I went to forums and conferences, workshops and lectures, and I met people. The folks I gravitated towards were community members, people like me. With one significant difference, most of them had lived through the Black Saturday fires. One of them was Daryl Taylor.
So the fire got in on the south side of the house, and I got back here about an hour after the fire started and managed to put the fire out after about 20 hours. And so we saved this side of the house to some degree, but the other side was really torched.
I bumped into Daryl often at various events, and at one point we collaborated on an idea that stalled in the water, a national community organisation for disaster. Not long after this, fired up and full of opinion, I found myself giving a talk at an emergency forum for government and community, which, to my great surprise and delight, I was then invited to give in Christchurch, New Zealand, which had recently been devastated by the 2011 earthquakes. I was, of course, pleased with this result, but it also felt like a bunch of hot air that wouldn't make one iota of difference in the end. It was Daryl who quietly said, "You never know where or how your words might land. A lot of change begins with people speaking." And it was Daryl who invited me to give that speech at a community forum he organised in Kinglake. So I wanted to interview him. I was kind of also hopeful he might have a video copy of that speech, so I could include excerpts of it here. But his texts were a bit on the gunner side, and in order to stop harassing him and to do the interview, one fine Saturday morning I headed due east to Kinglake. Kinglake is in the traditional lands and waters of the Tanarong people who lived and cared for country for thousands of years until forced off their lands by violence. It's now bucolic farmland surrounded by heavily forested hills, including the Kinglake National Park. Kinglake is a town proper, albeit a small one. It has a pub, a supermarket, a petrol station, a couple of cafes and a sports stadium, although the nearest high school is 25 kilometres away. Like Nuji, the first Europeans were gold prospectors, followed by fruit farmers and loggers and timber workers. On Black Saturday, when the winds swung to come from the southwest and the fire roared up and over the ridgeline in a wide sweep, over 100 people died. And it seems recovery in Kinglake was more complex, not the great unifier we heard about just down the road in Strathewen. While the stories I've heard vary a bit, And it's not in any way statistically sound. Everyone I've spoken to from or near Kinglake has talked about the recovery process there creating and further entrenching community division that's still felt today. This is Democracy After Disaster, a podcast about power and money and how communities recovering from bushfire or any disaster need to be empowered in their recovery if they're not to be further harmed by the systems meant to help them. My name's Kate Lawrence, and in this fourth episode we're going to Kinglake, a rural community on the edge of both Melbourne and a ridgeline that drew fire up and into it like water into a wicking bed. And we'll experience the fire recovery in this place through the thought lines of Kinglake resident Daryl Taylor. At some point, Daryl had mentioned that he was building an earthship, but I had no idea what on earth that was until I arrived and walked onto a half-acre of land, past a yurt and half a house into an open space a bit like an amphitheatre. And on one side, set into the back of a hill, was a large, dark building that was built onto the half-house that had already clearly been burnt in the 2009 fires. Daryl appears, starts to show me around, and along the way introduces me to a seemingly random assortment of folks.
G'day, how are you?
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Julian.
Julian's here from Holland.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and he's been here for 3 weeks, maybe?
No, 4.
4 already. Wow, yeah, cool.
Julian is a woofer, a traveller doing work for board and food. Daryl is a student of ideas, big, complex ideas, ones that challenge how we see the world and how we live with each other and the environment. And he's also really grounded and practical. Turns out an earthship is a self-sufficient building made mostly from local and recycled materials, designed and built to minimise environmental impact. Daryl's called his earthship kinship, sort of like Kinglake earthship. And when I asked if he set the place up as a venue, he replies in typical Daryl style at the cutting edge of language and concept.
A multifunction polis.
If you missed that, he said, it's a multi-function polis.
But it's still kind of on where to go.
That was not the last time I said, wow. Daryl's vision is thrilling, and what he had achieved so far was amazing. The main building was beautiful, with lots of recycled timbers and big glass windows looking over pools of bubbling water, which turned out to actually be a fancy sewage system.
Using every kind of kingdom of life to process. So there'll be fish and crustaceans and then microbes, and there'll be plants, and it produces potable water gathering from black water.
And of course, everything is designed with the threat of bushfire in mind. Daryl has not lived through Black Saturday for nothing.
The west side and the whole south side's all underground. That's a corridor through to a bunker. So even though the house is like a bunker, there's a bunker within the bunker, and that's that completely fire-safe area.
While the kinship concept is big, with an astounding 16 social, cultural and ecological enterprises attached to it, critical to the plan is the geographical community of Daryl's street.
So it's going to cook enough food for the whole street, and yeah, if we go into a zombie apocalypse, hopefully I won't get killed because I provide so much food.
In the middle of the amphitheatre is a fire pit ready to be lit, surrounded by a circle of about a dozen wicker lounge chairs. Daryl casually says they'll probably fire it up that evening with neighbours and woofers and other kinship community. I managed not to say, wow, but I'm almost ready to sell up in Macedon and move to kinship. Then, as we make our way up the block to the western corner, Daryl breaks the news.
I haven't been able to find your videos. You know what I mean? Hey, I found everyone else's video. You should be. There's
Okay.
It's 9 seconds.
All right. I know you're now as disappointed as I was, so here is a recreation of the start of this great oration. Nasruddin's a character from the Middle East, and he's known as a bit of a wise joker. One evening, Nasruddin's out the front of his house, in the street, on his hands and knees, obviously looking for something. A neighbour comes past. "What are you looking for, Nasruddin?" "I've lost a key." "I'll give you a hand." So the neighbour gets down on his hands and knees, and they both feel about under the street lamp, trying to find the key. After a while, the neighbour says, "Nasruddin, are you sure you lost your key out here?" No, I definitely lost it in the house." "Well, why on earth are you looking for it out here?" "Because there's more light out here, of course." In my mind, this is what government is doing with bushfire preparedness. They throw money at emergency management machines, science pyro labs, university departments and PhD candidates because they're easy to see. They're under the lamp. They have clean edges and things can be measured and controlled. But the key is with the people in their houses, in their streets, in their paddocks and forests. The key is with communities. And if as much time and attention and money was spent on communities as is spent on machines and researchers and consultants, we'd be a lot stronger and better prepared. Yes, massive applause. Daryl and I keep walking up the block to a small cottage that was trucked in after the fires, and it's where Daryl and his family lived in the years immediately following Black Saturday. And I set up my recording gear. Without me asking, Daryl begins with one of Kinglake's success stories from Black Saturday.
Dawn Harthog, who was a CFA captain, applied all the stuff that she knew to a street just over here, the other side of the main town centre. And yeah, every house in that street survived. The people were incredibly well prepared. They had all the right gear. They had all the right eye protection. They had walkie-talkies, and they just swarmed around the properties and protected everything and themselves and the kids. And it's a really good story, but it was just impossible to tell because 118 people were killed in the area. No one had a kind of a readiness to hear the stories of really well-organised survival.
But this degree of cooperation and preparedness doesn't happen without commitment and intention, and it doesn't happen overnight.
Dawn used to host people for lunch once a month. They shared food, they shared strategy, they used collective purchasing to buy all the equipment they all needed. They reviewed it and they bought the best equipment.
And of course, this kind of community interdependence in preparing for disaster prepares a community for the long haul of recovery, together. In Daryl Street, it was the COVID pandemic that was the great catalyst for building community connections.
We ran 2 events, one on a Monday night, which was movie night. Friday nights we'd have beers around the fire, and people weren't commuting 2 hours each way each day. Everyone was doing renovations, and everyone was helping everyone with renovations. We were helping put up sheds. People were coming here and helping lifting stuff. And, we'd never all been home together. Like, we know each other not just by name. We know what people's skills are, what they're really good at. And so we can kind of do a lot more with that.
Daryl's strategy is not just driven by the history of Black Saturday or the experience of his street during COVID. He is preparing for the climate emergency and the possibility of multi-level society-wide collapse. It can sound like apocalyptic thinking, but more and more the idea of widespread collapse has signs and science to support it.
I'd kind of like to do a bit of work around how our risk is likely to go up very quickly over the next 5 or 10 years, and what does that mean for preparedness, and how can that also be preparedness for the kind of multifaceted collapse. So how do you get your emergency management and your response as well as your recovery stuff also integrated with what is that going to mean for energy descent?
By energy descent, Daryl means the contracting availability and use of fossil fuels in a world completely dependent on them.
How do we look at how 30 or 40 households might be able to collaborate to get better outcomes than any one household might on its own?
From the climate crisis and energy descent, Daryl expands to institutional collapse.
I think the big institutions around emergency management are unviable in the long term, and they're based on a whole bunch of assumptions that are profoundly flawed, particularly around energy and money being available to run these big bureaucracies. And when you get a collapse, sort of depression, the whole thing ratchets down to what's possible at a local level, just because there's no longer the tax base when you have an economic depression or a collapse or whatever. That means we need to build profound levels of preparedness, and a lot of that's governance structures and ways of being more present in landscapes where you've got vulnerabilities.
Whether you agree with Daryl's predictions of a multi-level societal-wide collapse or not, there has clearly been an increase in natural disasters in recent decades, and the weather conditions around the globe appear certain to worsen. And for Daryl, this means we all need to participate in preparedness, individually and most importantly, collectively.
So that the recovery is something that's anticipated, not this thing that you just have to do because everything all of a sudden has been obliterated out of the blue. Developing both social and ecological literacy is really, really, really important, so that, you're building social capital and you're also building an interaction with your environment and your climate or your weather systems, so your topography. So people know, we're on a ridge and fire will operate differently in the different valleys. So that super local knowledge is really important. It's something that's the province of the people who live there, and it's intergenerational knowledge, older men and older women will know this kind of stuff as well. Being able to kind of be literate about landscapes and where water flows down, fire roars up, and understand that we're this island continent that gets influenced by weather on at least three fronts. We have these patterns, and the patterns might wobble and be a bit different with climate change, or they may just be exacerbated. That should be what people who live in a place know.
Daryl and his community's experience after Black Saturday was directly impacted by the quality and capacity of their local government.
We've got a massive democratic deficit in Victoria because we amalgamated local government authorities, so there really is no local government, it's regional.
Daryl compares the size and capacity of Murrindindi, the shire he lives in, and the neighbouring city of Whittlesea. Murrindindi is 7 times the area of Whittlesea, but with less than a tenth of the population.
And so there's no capacity. When, for example, Brumby came up.
Brumby was the Premier of Victoria at the time of the Black Saturday fires.
And we met him outside the pub. He said, okay, it's time to implement the emergency management plan. Sorry, we don't have one.
Yep, you heard that right. Murrindindi Shire, where over 100 people died and 40% of the shire was burnt, at the time of the fires, had an emergency management plan that the Royal Commission said did not have
plans to prevent or respond to bushfires or to evacuate Marysville or any other township in the shire.
There wasn't a current public health plan. That was where we went next. Is there a public? No, we don't have a public health planner, so there's no public health plan. And these were all legislative responsibilities, just reflects a lack of capacity.
Another issue making community self-reliance in Kinglake a necessity is distance. In particular, the distance to the administrative centre of the shire in Alexandra, which is over an hour from Kinglake.
I can be swimming in Port Phillip Bay before I can get to Alexandra. It's just so far away that it's not part of anyone's world here.
Underneath all of Daryl's thinking is a different world view from the one currently dominant in our Western culture.
For me, the fundamental unit of humanity is community, not individuality. And so, that's where humans thrive, when they're sharing their skills and their knowledge and lifting everyone up by doing things together.
Daryl stretches this idea in a direction I never would have thought of, despite my legal training, or maybe even because of it.
I think one of the big challenges in recovery is that communities are not constituted in law, so individuals are constituted in law, corporations are constituted in law, communities have no status.
I saw a vivid illustration of the impact of this lack of status when, a few months after Black Saturday, the Victorian Government Community Consultation Roadshow came to a town near me to ask us, as communities at risk of bushfire, for our opinion. We sat at tables in small groups with someone from the organisers on each table taking some notes. We were given a topic. Let's say it was evacuations. We were given a list of relevant Royal Commission recommendations and a set of questions. We were invited to talk them through, which we dutifully did for a while. And then, mid-conversation, a hand came over the top of our heads, removing the word evacuations and depositing the words fuel reduction, along with a sheet referring to the Royal Commission recommendations and posing some questions for our conversation. Other topics similarly dropped into our midst. Things like power lines, land acquisition, local government. All night I sat waiting for the simple word community to be dropped down. I got really excited for a split second when a topic dropped and I read the word community, but I slumped back down when it was immediately followed by the word refuges. And it never came, that word. We were never invited to discuss our role as communities. How could we prepare? How could we participate? What was our relationship with all the other players, and what were we to them, and how they could and should engage with us? Government sought our advice on what they should do to protect us, but in the prevailing style of patronising paternalism, they did not see any need to ask us how we might work to protect ourselves. It might not be immediately obvious how communities could be made legal entities, but the law is what we make it. It's a human construct, and with some legal imagination, which some of you might think is an oxymoron, it's entirely possible to create legal status for a community. And this could provide a great and much needed counterweight to the force of the capitalist corporate entity. Again, the lived experience of the recovery from Black Saturday is a clear foundation of Daryl's thinking.
So the big fire footprint in this area was 5 local government authorities, and instead of allowing them to lead the recovery process with the citizens, that was led by VBRA.
VBRA is an acronym for the Victorian Bushfire Reconstruction and Recovery Authority, set up by the Victorian State Government in the wake of the Black Saturday fires.
Which was something that was created in Spring Street, and it was reported to the Premier, and 6 months after the fire it still had zero capability.
So it seems the Victorian government was doing what Professor Iverson is describing here.
The risk for liberal democracies is always that we panic a bit and we say, we need to concentrate power, we need to, focus power into fewer hands so we can get on with things and get things done. But that's often the worst thing probably that could happen. And I think sometimes we see that play out on the ground in all kinds of ways.
State governments are big and unwieldy. 6 months is a very long time to wait for staff, rules, guidance and processes to land on the fire recovery ground, which leads into Daryl's next point.
There needs to be the standing capacity at the local community level. Communities are complex and they're dynamic, and bureaucracies tend to ossify or try to put something in data or in words, and then it becomes a permanent form of knowledge, whereas it's much more dynamic on the ground. And you need that self-organising systems, and learning is so much more important than knowing. So this contrast between the screen-based data and the emergent dynamics was what we were trying to say is the difference between an other organising system from the centre, top-down command and control, and that which is bottom-up, dynamic and emergent and responsive to changing conditions. And we've had those systems, communities, invalidated for the last 40 years.
Then Daryl zooms out to look at the context for community across time and place.
Community development was a big part of Victoria, particularly Melbourne, in the 70s. We did really well out of the Australian Assistance Plan. We had a progressive, small L Liberal government at the time, and they did really well supporting more autonomy for communities, as well as the Labor government at the federal level. And because Victoria's compact enough, things took off in Victoria that wouldn't take off in Queensland or Western Australia just because of scale. And so there's a really rich tradition of that, and that tradition lasted till about Hawke and Keating, and then they did the Thatcher-Reagan kind of neoliberal thing.
The Thatcher-Reagan neoliberal thing, which we touched on in the last episode, where these two world leaders, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and President of the United States and others, took up the ideas being championed by the economist Milton Friedman, who was a feature on nightly television with ideas like this.
And the great virtue of a market capitalist society is that by preventing a concentration of power, it prevents people from doing the kind of harm which really concentrated power can do. But capitalism tends to give free rein to the more humane values of human beings.
It is only too clear after 40 years that the neoliberal free market has neither prevented concentration of power nor improved human morality. We now have incredible levels of power and money centralised in the hands of global corporations and a few individuals. And as for our morals, our unconstrained greed has led to exploitation of natural systems to the point of annihilation. Tech giants manipulate our minds for profit and political control. Human slavery and trafficking numbers are soaring, and on and on and on. As I watched more and more videos of Milton Friedman, I could feel myself being pulled in by the arguments and analogies, the simplistic and seductive black and white thinking. But closer examination showed the false logic, the grains of truth stretched to distortion, and the ultimately hollow foundations.
There's one thing you can depend on everybody else to do. You can absolutely depend on them. You can always depend on them to put his interest ahead of yours.
Pretty sure the one person we can depend on to put his interests ahead of ours is Milton Friedman. Ronald Reagan, US President from 1980 to 1988, called Milton Friedman his friend and actively promoted his book and TV series. And as president, he consistently applied his ideas by promoting business interests and attacking government bureaucracy.
Government's view of the economy could be summed up in a few short phrases. If it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it.
Our biggest problem is that we have built a permanent structure of government, federal, state, and local. The permanent employees. I don't know anyone with less influence today in government than business. They're just a convenient whipping boy.
The impact of neoliberalism in a whole range of fields has been like a 40-year fog rolling in from the sea, clouding everything and becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Part of the challenge is that a lot of government capability has been hollowed out. And that means that when people, especially in crises and disasters, turn to the government for help, all of a sudden they discover that in a sense the cupboard is sort of bare. There aren't the capabilities there. There aren't the resources there.
So at the same time expectation of government has increased, government capacity has been whittled away via neoliberal policies. And when the public service fails, it provides more ammunition for anti-government forces to reduce bureaucracy. None of this is to say there aren't significant problems with modern bureaucracies. Even without neoliberal attacks, there are. But the neoliberal agenda has always been destructive, not constructive. And so any problems are made worse. This is one of Reagan's more famous lines.
The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help."
From what we now know, this is exactly what the folks in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina were desperate to hear. When we're standing on a fault line, unsure if it's a geological phenomena or fracking, wondering how we got here and where here is anyway, it's probably time to turn to the poets.
In Those Years by Adrian Rich. In those years, people will say we lost track of the meaning of we, of you. We found ourselves reduced to I, and the whole thing became silly, ironic, terrible. We were trying to live a personal life, and yes, that was the only life we could bear witness to. But the great dark birds of history screamed and plunged into our personal weather. They were headed somewhere else, but their beaks and pinions drove along the shore through the rags of fog, where we stood saying, I.
The good news is that while neoliberalism has been doing its best to turn us into selfish individualists, other fields of study offer to put the humanity back into human identity. First up, there's the field of evolutionary biology, which explains cooperative behaviours over and above aggressive self-interest. Here's Professor Paul Atkins from the Australian National University and co-author of the book Pro-Social.
For at least 41 years, we've been telling ourselves the story that we're actually quite selfish. It's the greed is good ethos that's underpinned neoliberalism, and it's led to a particular type of view of humanity as Homo economicus. We're inherently separate, self-interested, and all we're about is maximising our own utility. But in actuality, you can see evidence from small groups all around the world that, generally speaking, lived in conditions reasonably egalitarian and highly cooperative. We totally evolved in that space.
It's not that this idea is new. Darwin himself explains it this way.
There can be no doubt that a tribe including many members who were always ready to aid one another and to sacrifice themselves for the common good would be victorious over most other tribes, and this would be natural selection.
That was an AI voice. This has now been developed into the evolutionary theory of multi-level selection.
Multi-level selection theory, that it's basically talking about evolution occurring at every level, at the level of cells in our body that are being generated and pruned and so forth and dying, at the level of organs, at the level of us as an individual, we're evolving, but also at the level of our groups. There are certain cultures evolving and groups that are more or less successful and more or less likely to spread their practices. And of course, as a globe, we're evolving. For me, that idea of evolution provides hope. We're in a position now where we don't have to just react to evolutionary processes. We can actually choose them.
And this is important because
our beliefs about other people really matter. The more you think others are selfish, not only are you less likely to vote, you're less likely to volunteer, you're less likely to feel responsibility for your community, and the more likely you are to be socially alienated, to not belong.
Second is the theory of self-governance developed by Elinor Ostrom. For about the last half-century, another economic concept closely related to neoliberalism has also been doing the rounds. It's the tragedy of the commons. Here's Ostrom, the 2009 winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics, explaining.
When Gerhard Harden published his paper in Science in 1968 on the tragedy of the commons, I thought, gee, he has just made this up. Because he talked of, imagine a pasture open to anyone. It wasn't, here's my data. It is imagine a pasture open. And in that imagined pasture, people didn't talk. They just put as many animals on as they possibly could, because whatever was left to eat, somebody else would grab. Well, that became almost like a religion. And the presumption was that humans were helpless and that they had to have a government tell them how to do this and take over or make it privatize it. So, but an external authority had to come in and do it, as if the external authority had people in it who had different genes.
Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for her work studying groups, hundreds of groups, all around the world, who successfully managed common resources without either an external authority or private ownership, often for hundreds and even thousands of years. She then codified a list of 8 core design principles of groups that successfully manage their common resources, and you can find links to this list on the show website. If your own eyes and ears and experiences didn't already make clear that humans have great capacity for care, achieve more when we cooperate, and are inherently capable of self-organising, these 2 concepts, multi-level selection and cooperative management of common resources, are powerful evidence for a very different way of thinking about how we can naturally embody democracy at the local level. But of course, in the existing world, neoliberalism is accepted orthodoxy, hierarchy reigns supreme, and capitalist consumerism has subsumed all notions of responsible citizenship.
And then we've lived in that world of hyper-individualism with both men and women working for corporates or big business or government or NGOs or whatever, but all vertical structures, so professional knowledge prevails and place-based community knowledge has disappeared. Like, we've seen a massive atrophy in participation in community, and we've certainly seen that since Black Saturday.
Daryl's not the only person I've spoken to in making this podcast who's noticed the declining levels of community participation. And more than one person has immediately then mentioned Robert Putnam, academic and author of the book Bowling Alone. Here's Putnam talking in 1995.
I was interested in the question, why are some places better governed than others? We thought maybe education was the secret ingredient. We thought maybe wealth would be what counted, or the character of the political party system, or well, we had lots of different ideas. Mean temperature at noon seemed like it was a possible explanatory variable, but it turned out some places had dense networks of civic engagement. They were engaged with one another in lots of civic organizations, choral societies and football clubs and reading groups and Rotary clubs and so on. And government in those places worked.
Putnam and his colleagues then made another surprising discovery in these places where government was successful and there was dense social engagement.
There was also a relatively higher level of economic development. And for a long time, we thought that was because wealth produced choral societies. But it turned out, when we looked more carefully at the history of these regions, that we had it exactly backwards. It wasn't that wealth produced choral societies. It was that choral societies produced wealth.
So then they began to study the levels of social capital, and the decline they observed in the latter half of the 20th century was startling. On almost every indicator, we are less connected to our community. They asked people,
have you at all ever in the last year been to some meeting where there was discussion of school or community affairs?
Good question to ask yourself, because
the number of us who say yes has declined by 40% over this last 20-25 years.
In Australia, Volunteering Australia confirms this decline, and the downward trend has continued since Putnam was talking in 1995. School committees, service clubs, church attendance, trade union membership, volunteerism, Red Cross numbers have been falling off a cliff. And for Daryl and communities recovering from disaster, lack of social capital can cause a second disaster.
People are exhausted, they're burnt out, they're just profoundly disappointed by the experience of the recovery. It was as if not more injurious for a lot of people as the initial disaster itself.
This is damning testimony indeed, a compounding of the trauma through the very institutions meant to support and enable recovery in Kinglake.
Some people did well, they were well insured, they were able to achieve their rebuild within 2 years and were able to get on with their life to some degree. But the fabric, that social fabric, that was tattered.
And whether the tattering came before government took over or the other way around, the vacuum created by lack of social capital allowed the recovery to be
so controlled by centralised institutions, and there was no room for any power for local people.
This is the impact that Steve, just down the road in Strathewen, feared, and which they avoided by organising themselves. Daryl's a political philosophical thinker, and he draws on two concepts to help make sense of what he observed in Kinglake's recovery.
One is the horizontal violence of the mutually oppressed.
The horizontal violence of the mutually oppressed. It's a theory developed by Paulo Freire, the renowned Brazilian educator and philosopher.
We saw that dynamic 2 years in. People were just like, instead of identifying that it was the command and control system that was not allowing them to do the things that they knew needed to be done, we turned on each other.
The other idea is a concept from Germaine Greer's Little Book of Rage, which Daryl describes as...
It's an excellent summary of what happens when you're not empowered in your own environment. And so hers was the internal violence of the chronically repressed. So when you turn away from the dynamics that you can't influence, but you don't express it, then it manifests as some form of illness and potentially premature death. Again, we can identify people who that happened to here, in our street, in our neighbourhood, etc.
In addition to these two concepts, there's another one that hangs on the coattails of every disaster. And it's as blunt as these two are sophisticated. It's called money.
Donations are pouring in from across the globe.
Paul Ramsay Foundation will donate $30 million.
In WA, an extraordinary $70 million contribution from mining magnate Andrew Twiggy Forrest.
Disasters are big business and give immense power and potential to distort and corrupt to those who hold the purse strings or have the wherewithal to access the coffers. In Tasmania in 1967, the fires turned out to be a great stimulus for the Tasmanian economy, and the state's premier was able to say,
"If it were possible to overlook the tragic loss of life and property and personal hardships suffered by individuals, it could be said that the long-term effects of the fire will not be detrimental."
Like many things in our neoliberal hyper-capitalist reality, where there's money, even money marked for those who have lost everything, the profiteers will follow. Disaster business has a dark side. In 2024, Oxfam published a report that found Australian companies made at least $98 billion in crisis profits between 2021 and 2023 as a result of the pandemic and the Ukraine war. And this is where the work of Naomi Klein comes in. She's an American journalist and author of the book The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism.
I think that there's a particular way of thinking that comes with being in the business of disaster. I'm talking about those particular economic holdings that increase, whose fortunes increase when things go bad. The reason why Eisenhower gave that famous warning about the danger of the military-industrial complex is precisely because this is an industry that has an economic incentive for war.
Klein goes on to name high-ranking US political figures like Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Rudy Giuliani, and George Bush.
So these are all people who see profit directly from terrorism, natural disasters, and pandemics.
Klein argues there are also wider ramifications.
Faced with a crisis, we often fall apart, regress, and that becomes a window for anti-democratic forces to push societies backwards, to become more unequal and more unstable.
And that's where you have what I call disaster capitalism.
And it's not just in the wake of disasters that the capitalists move in. In 2022, the global disaster preparedness market was worth $162 billion, and it's predicted to grow at a rate of 8.4% over the coming decade. That's a hell of a lot of tools and tech and trucks. In Australia, you only have to look at the AFAC conference. AFAC somehow stands for Australasian Fire and Emergency Services, and the conference is the biggest emergency management shindig in the country. I attended it in 2022 when it was in Adelaide, and we'll hear more about this in later episodes. But for now, I want to highlight the centrepiece of the gathering, the exhibition. In the middle of the Adelaide Convention Centre was a huge space described by the conference organisers as
Australia's premier and most comprehensive emergency management and first responders exhibition.
I took a spin around the room and it was easy to see that this was big money. There were giant machines, fire trucks, SES trucks, squat trucks that but for the yellow paint would look at home in a war zone. There were uniforms and boots, protective fabrics and headgear. There was gas detection and fall protection kits. There were goggles and nozzles, lots and lots of nozzles. There were engines and pumps and hoses and computers and warning systems and tech solutions. There was emergency housing, and there was the Bronto Skylift F-28 ALR. And everywhere there was branding and giant pictures of first responders, or as most companies like to call them, heroes. And the slogans: pride, passion, protection, quietly leading. We know what's at stake. There weren't so many women in the room, although there were some enormous pictures of them. And scattered about were areas set up with tables and chairs and couches and potted plants, places to talk business and do multi-million-dollar deals with public money. Here's Daryl's take on how disaster capitalism played out in Kinglake's recovery.
We had our businesses, like half the main street was wiped out. No one had the capacity to buy the properties, and so instead what happened was they were bought by rich people who lived somewhere else. And what are they looking for? They're looking for a return for a slow investment over a long period of time. So those blocks of land, 13 years later, are still vacant in the main street, and we don't have a coherent centre. Having a coherent centre allows us to be better organised because there's more social and convivial activity, so there's more sharing of information and all that kind of stuff. There's all sorts of other dynamics that play out if communities aren't empowered, and if they can't govern their own recovery, then they're at risk of disaster capitalists.
So there's huge potential for profiteering on the one hand, and on the other,
there's never been more economic opportunity than the aftermath of disaster. We had 770 houses destroyed, plus a whole bunch of public and private buildings. And there was construction, and then there was all the work that supports construction, like food. There's timber milling. It's not hard to imagine an ecology of enterprises that you can use in the aftermath of a fire. You can build people's participation in economic activity, and you can ensure that the investment is commensurate with what's emerging on the ground by allowing people to decide how to spend the budget. There's power in community development if there's community ownership.
It's not hard to imagine, and yet it seems a bridge too far in our current world order. And it's not just private businesses who capitalise on the recovery landscape.
I don't call it recovery. I think it's a dumbass name. It's a name that's like a whistle, a dog whistle for welfare, for church organisations, for everyone to come in and have their agenda. We've got a Catholic church, we've got this massive other church. We didn't have those churches here before the fires. So they've come in with their missionary response, there's a medical response, there's all these different responses that come in with their own agenda, capitalising on the thing.
In spite of these bleak and hidden consequences of disasters, disasters often enable a massive release of human energy, at least some of the time.
There's going to be amazing emergent things happen in the aftermath of a disaster. In the immediate aftermath, people will do incredible things. It happens all over the world. It's a lay-down misère. Rebecca Solnit, in her book, A Paradise Built in Hell, she describes 100 years of it in America, of that phenomenon.
Rebecca Solnit is another respected American journalist and author. Here she is talking about the book Daryl mentioned.
The mainstream assumption about human nature for the last 150 years or so has been the idea that we're essentially selfish, that competition is the law of survival, etc. It's what justifies marketplace economics, capitalism, the way corporations behave, etc. Most people, in fact, in disasters are altruistic, generous, brave, improvisational, deeply communitarian. And not only do they behave really well, but they sometimes find in disaster, even though it's terrible, even though there's been loss of life and everything's been disrupted, they find a sense of community and purpose and agency that's so profound that they also find a great joy in disaster.
And she affirms Daryl's view that the fundamental unit of humanity is community.
Actually, we're a species that survives by and desires community. Actually, we're a collective species. Actually, altruism is how we're hardwired. People want to belong. They deeply desire to belong, to have membership in something larger than themselves, to have a voice in society, to matter.
But membership can come at a cost to others when we become, even in the face of disaster, insular and exclusive, as the New South Wales bushfire inquiry found in 2020.
The inquiry was disappointed to learn that in some communities, Aboriginal people felt unwelcome at evacuation centres, and in some cases, support services were reluctant to provide immediate relief.
One of the things I talk about in this book is I feel like we're always told that all our problems are personal. You know, your mother didn't love you enough, or you're thwarted because of some very personal thing going on. But I feel like a lot of people are thwarted all the time because they don't have deeply meaningful work, a strong audible voice in their community, a sense of public participation and accountability. And when you see how people light up, and I've seen it both being around actual disasters like Hurricane Katrina and 9/11, and I've seen it in hundreds of accounts of people, you see how deeply people desire this, that, you know, it's not the individual versus the community, but the individual only reaches his or her fullest flowering as a member of the community. That we not only have this public love, which is this love I talked about, this kind of altruistic love for place and community, for a city or a neighborhood, for the process that's democracy and participation, but we love being that person who has a role, who has agency.
Solnit is not saying that benevolence is the only human trait appearing in the aftermath of disaster, but she is saying that even amongst response horrors like New Orleans after Katrina, you'll always find small human utopias. At the same time, others are exploiting vulnerabilities to make a profit or gain power.
The disasters are going to continue because we're going to continue to use the oil, and we're going to continue to reinforce inequity in our systems and injustice at the end of the day. You need to have a kaleidoscopic, holistic kind of go at these things, but because we invest so little, if anything, in community, then we get degenerative ecosystems and degenerative communities. And so we've got to shift from the economy being the end and the social and the ecological being the means that you extract and exploit, to the economy as the means to deliver mature, resilient, regenerative social and ecological systems. And we've just got that back around it. I think we need a commons-oriented political economy, a system that doesn't suck up all the wealth to the centre or to the most wealthy. And we need something that distributes the wealth. And a commons-oriented political economy, the acronym is COPE. And I think that's what we'll need to do. We'll need to learn how to cope together.
I have been down so many rabbit holes making this episode. But there comes a time when you have to say enough. So if you need a rabbit hole of your own, Google Commons-Oriented Political Economy, COPE, and I'll catch you on the next episode, where we'll be exploring the more recent past, the Black Summer fires of 2019-2020, and the isolated forest town of Malakuta. which became famous for all the wrong reasons.
So we've got embers going into Malakuta at the moment. We've got 4,000 people on the beach there.
And remarkable for all the right ones.
In a rare moment of unity, the residents of Malakuta and its surrounding districts are trying a bold experiment in self-determination.
Democracy After Disaster is written, produced and hosted by me, Kate Lawrence from Story Ground. This podcast is made on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to ancestors and elders. I thank them for their careful and sacred use of fire in this landscape and their inspiring sense of community. This project is auspiced by Highlands FM community radio station and supported by a grant from the National Australia Bank. Huge thanks in this episode to Sue Yardley and Ainsley Munro-Lawrence for lending their voices to dramatise moments as only a living, breathing human voice can. If you like this podcast, please rate and review it wherever you listen, and most importantly, tell your colleagues, friends and family. And if you have any comments, questions or feedback, please email me, kate@storyground.com.au. Thanks for listening.